Hello, we now look at Colonial America in the 18th century. This roughly corresponds with Chapter 5 in our main textbook. I'm going to be breaking this PowerPoint presentation and lecture into pieces, but it's no longer or shorter than any of the others. I don't need to explain why I'm doing that, but it works, so we're going to do it that way. In this unit, which I've subtitled Prosperity Implements and Trends in 18th century colonial America. Remember, heretofore we've been talking about the 17th century, so we're moving into a new century on our way to trying to understand the American Revolution and the crisis with Great Britain, leading to that conflict and eventually American independence and the birth of the United States. But we need to get some background, some context to understand that. So we're going to look at economic trends in the British Empire in North America, including British economic policy towards the colonies. We're going to take a glance at two later developing colonies that will be of extreme importance to us going forward, both as colonies and states. That's New York and Pennsylvania. More on that in a while. Then we will stop and go into a little bit more depth on the origins and development of American slavery. We have talked about slavery in early Virginia. The settlers, of course, they're using tobacco and plantation slavery as the backbone of their economy. We're going to sort of widen and broaden our glance and look at slavery from that viewpoint here, recognizing that slavery is going to be a big part of our class the rest of the way. Then some economic and demographic trends in the 18th century, focusing mainly on prosperity and growing opportunity, which was true, and we'll see it in statistically and through the evidence. It's clear that from one century to the next, 17th to 18th, the colonies were increasing in prosperity and opportunity abounded. And we're going to use one individual, quite famous, Benjamin Franklin, as a symbol, as an embodiment of the growing opportunity of the 18th century. And we'll round out the lecture by looking at a religious development, a religious movement of the time, the Great Awakening, and an intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, which spanned the 18th century, began in Europe, but spread across the Atlantic to the colonies, and a tremendous impact there. Both the Great Awakening and Enlightenment having a huge impact, one could say, right up to the present, especially in the latter case of the Enlightenment. So we're looking at here broader trends. We're not talking about so much in this unit as about events, there'll be some, but more about cultural trends, demographic trends, economic forces, cultural forces, religious forces, and intellectual forces and trends as well. So here we go. Before getting into all that, however, looking at this map in front of us, it's a quite simple one, as you can see, and that's why I like it. It depicts or shows and labels the New England colonies, which you see Massachusetts, Connecticut, etc., and talks about some of the products that they produce. But I mainly just put this simple picture up there to get us to see something, a couple of simple things. One is that by this time there are 13 colonies. We've only talked about a couple so far. We made brief mention of some of the others. But by the time we're talking, say, mid-18th century, there are 13 English colonies that are very loosely held together. They don't cooperate much, if at all. This is going to be a problem, as we see going on in later units. But the second thing I want you to get from this simple little map is to understand that historians studying colonial America, and that means 17th and 18th century America, where we are now, divide the 13 colonies regionally into three regional blocks. The New England or northern colonies, which you see actually all labeled here, the middle colonies, which you don't see labeled here, the biggest of them being Pennsylvania and New York, the two that we're going to talk about at some length in this lecture, and the southern colonies, at least one of which we've talked about in Virginia. That's the big one in yellow. So all the stuff from yellow below are southern colonies. So historians talk about the New England or northern colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. So three regional groupings. The expansion of the British Empire in North America does, of course, primarily mean the growth of the 13 colonies, but we need to understand a little bit more about some of the colonies themselves that are growing into the 18th century and some of the larger economic developments. the British were practicing a form of economic policy, an economic theory, one could say, known as mercantilism or mercantilism. It's on the outline. All European countries actually practiced mercantilism at the time. And for our purposes, what this means, though it could get more complicated, is that European countries like Great Britain and France, Spain, that had colonies abroad, overseas, tended to gear their own economic policy at home, their laws, and the laws passed to try to control their colonial economies so as to best fit the needs of the home country. So that economic policy towards the colonies, whether it be Massachusetts, New York, or Georgia, whatever it might be, the most important thing done by the British Parliament or to the British Parliament was to make sure that those colonies were producing, buying goods, engaging in economic activity in ways that benefited the home and mother country first and foremost. Now, if those policies happen to also benefit the colonies, then so much the better. But the point is that the mother country, the home country, used the colonies as an appendage of their own economy, and the goal was to benefit that home economy. The most famous way in which this was done were through a series of laws passed by the British Parliament in the 17th century, the Navigation Acts, three big ones in 1651, 1660, and 1663. In one of those, Oliver Cromwell, who was virtually a dictator in England during the 1650s, the decade of the 1650s, was responsible for initiating the first one of those. This then was the specific laws and policies passed by Britain to try to control the 13 English colonies. One of them, for instance, was a law passed that established what were referred to as enumerated goods, which enumerated just meant a list of goods and products that the colonies, by law, were prohibited from producing on their own. The big one on the list that stands out is textiles. So this is just to give us an example of what a Navigation Act looked like and what mercantilist policy looked like from the perspective of the colonies. So with textiles on the list as part of the law, as one of the enumerated goods, what that meant was that the colonists were prohibited by law from producing textiles, cloth, and clothing. That's because the British were trying to gear the colonial economies to best fit their own economy in England and force the colonies to buy British-made cloth and clothing. They didn't want to have to compete with the cloth and clothing made in Massachusetts, so they prohibited their colonists from producing it. There are all kinds of other examples of mercantilism that benefited Britain first and foremost, and were designed to make sure that the colonists were there producing, consuming for the benefit first and foremost of Great Britain. Next, we look at the development of New York as a colony. And the first thing we have to point out here is this was originally a Dutch colony stuck right in the middle of the other English colonies. So there were English colonies to the north and to the south already when the Dutch sort of plunked their own colony down right in the middle, the colony of New Netherland, the city, which is now New York City, they named New Amsterdam. And the Dutch early on saw the economic potential of what's now New York City. Then it was just the lower tip of Manhattan, the southernmost portion of New York City. And we'll be talking mostly about New York City here today, but by extension, the larger colony and eventually state of New York as well. But the Dutch had purchased the southern tip of Manhattan from Native Americans, famously, for a pittance. And in a series of wars, the three Anglo-Dutch wars in the 17th century, the English were able to pry Manhattan and New York away from the Dutch. Even though they lost one of those wars, they were able to keep New York. And also, they did this because they recognized the importance and potential of this. Why did Native Americans, then the Dutch, then the English see New York and Manhattan specifically, New York City, as having so much potential? Because it's one of the greatest natural harbors in the world, meaning it's got lots of places for docks and wharves and warehouses and places for ships to tie up. Manhattan is an island, technically speaking. And not only that, but it's protected, the harbor is protected from the outer sea, so protected from some of the harshest sort of sea coastal weather because it's inland. It's somewhat like the natural harbor of San Francisco on the west coast that we might be more familiar with here. So another very important natural harbor. So nature just blessed this area or blessed anyone that controlled it with all kinds of opportunities for economic gain. So quickly, New York became an important port and strategic location for economic, trade, commercial activity. The original Dutch colony was under the control of a private corporation, the Dutch East India Company, a private sort of chartered company, something like the Virginia Company, which we talked about when we dealt with 17th century Jamestown and Virginia. Its original director, Peter Stuyvesant, I don't need to spell it for you, it's on the outline, but Stuyvesant understood himself the great potential of New York City, New York Harbor, and started to build the docks and wharves and facilities to fix and build ships, and extended that throughout his tenure in control of Dutch New Amsterdam and New Netherland. But after the Second Anglo-Dutch War, as already noted, the English took control of it. The treaty that ended that war left New York, New Amsterdam, in the hands of the English, which they rapidly named New York, both the city and in this case the colony as well. And it was a proprietary colony, technically speaking, at first. We haven't, I think, talked about this, at least other than brief passing mention, and that is the English colonies we're dealing with here were of three different varieties. There were charter colonies, which are those that were a company was given a charter, essentially a license to do business by the English government and king. Virginia was a chartered company. The Virginia Company got a charter, a legal grant of authority from the king, and they were allowed then to found, to run, administer, operate their own colony. So the British government then only indirectly controlled a charter colony like Virginia. Then there are royal colonies, in which the English government and king took more direct control, had more direct control by appointing a governor, an appointee of the king himself, who went out and ruled directly for the king and reported straight back to the king. Virginia actually went from being a charter company, a charter colony, to a royal colony itself. So some of them did more than one. And the third type we see here, at least for a short time in New York, and this is called a proprietary colony. A proprietary colony was much like a charter colony, but instead of giving the colony over to be run and operated by a corporation, it was controlled by an individual, one single person. In this case, the Duke of York. And York is named after the Duke of York. And Duke is a position on the highest rung of the nobility in England and Europe as a whole. But if you were the Duke of York, you weren't just any Duke, which means you were even higher ranking than that. Well, how do you get more higher ranking than a Duke? Well, throughout English history, the Duke of York has been a position that's always been held by the king's brother. So this guy, James, Duke of York, who you see on the lower left of your screen, happened to be the younger brother of Charles II, the King of England. He would go on to become King of England himself for only 3 years. Only 3 years, because he was one of the most hated kings, and one could argue one of the worst kings in English history. Ironically, New York as a city and state is still named after one of the worst kings in England's history, even now. But as a proprietor, a guy given a colony, and since he's the king's brother, he's a proprietor with a great deal of power. He imposed a set of laws quickly known as the Duke's Laws. James had been a gifted military commander, a naval admiral, but he was less effective as a ruler, as a king, and the Duke's Laws didn't last for very long. Why? Because we get a quick lesson in what New York has been about almost from its beginning. In fact, much of what we'll talk about here today are all things that we still can associate and do rightly associate with New York up until the present, into 2018, and yet we can trace them back to virtually the beginnings of the history of this colony. And so here's our first example. The Duke's laws were none too democratic. Not that democracy was breaking out in any of the colonies, but these laws were less representative than anything we've seen so far, certainly less than any of the New England colonies that we know are moving at least in the direction of democracy. And because they lacked representation of any really group besides the Duke and his whim, his decisions, the rising power and wealth of the New York merchants, remember, New York is first and foremost a place, a commercial center, a place where business is done and a place where fortunes are made. So the merchants of New York quickly rose up in opposition to the Duke's laws and demanded, among other things, an elected assembly, something like the House of Burgesses that we saw in Virginia, something like the general court governments of the New England colonies, all of which had elected legislatures. So the merchants certainly wanted to be represented. They weren't concerned so much about the public being able to vote, but they were very concerned about themselves having a say in government. And in the Charter of Liberties that they eventually won, this demand was granted. So the merchants, the economic movers and shakers of early New York, flexed their muscles early on and got what they wanted. One could argue that the economic muscle in New York has gotten what it's wanted ever since. Another aspect of early New York that we can still see, I think, today, see traces of today, stems from, or an example of it anyway, stems from something that happened in 1657 when it was still a Dutch colony, when it was still New Amsterdam and New Netherland. 1657 is several years before the English took over. And I think the Dutch influence can be partially seen in this now famous event that's commemorated by the stamp you see on the screen from 1957, so the 300-year anniversary of the Flushing Remonstrance. Flushing is not a reference to your toilet. It's a place in New York, part of the borough of Queens in New York now. But a remonstrance is a petition, a demand, a written demand. So the postage stamp, obviously, from a long time ago, 1957, because it's 3 cents. But nonetheless, it shows that this event has been commemorated hundreds of years, after the event itself. So what happened? It doesn't sound that important, but it does, I think, say something important about New York, what it was and what it's been about in part ever since. The Flushing Remonstrance was a written demand by a number of important New Yorkers, fairly wealthy and powerful, to the governor of the colony, demanding that Quakers, a religious group that we're going to meet in this very lecture, get and deserved better treatment. They were being persecuted to some degree, and the Flushing Remonstrance was a letter, a petition, a demand signed by a handful of citizens demanding better treatment of Quakers. What makes this document remarkable is that it wasn't signed by any Quakers. These were all non-Quakers concerned about the rights of a religious group that none of them were members of. So it's an example of a sign of something we still see in New York today, and that is sort of tolerance of other people's views, tolerance of other people's religions, tolerance of other people's lifestyles. New York City especially, is one of the most liberal places in America. I would argue the two most liberal cities in America by far are San Francisco and New York. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, it just is. But this was already in a way somewhat true as far back as the Flushing Remonstrance of 1657. In the 17th century, you just didn't see people coming to someone else's defense sort of on their own, someone other groups' defense on their own, just for the sake of it sort of being the right thing to do, for the sake of religious freedom or toleration of lifestyle, whatever it may be. New York, as a colony, as well as a city, was not free of conflict and not free of class conflict. And we see this in Leisler's rebellion, 1689, so right around the same time as these other events. Jacob Leisler was a descendant of Dutch immigrants to the Dutch colony when it was that. And there was a Dutch influence ongoing. The English did not kick Dutch colonists and their descendants out. And so there was kind of a mixing of Dutch and English culture in New York, giving it its kind of own unique flavor. And for quite some time, even into the 19th century, some of the richest colonists in New York colony and state were of Dutch extract and origin. But Leisler was from an average background and became the ringleader of a rebellion, something like Bacon's Rebellion, which we've already studied, which was only about 13 years before this, further to the south. And this rebellion, like Bacon's Rebellion, failed after some bloodshed. But it had a similar effect as Bacon's in that, though failing, it did put the movers and shakers, the wealthy and powerful, in this case mostly the merchants, the wealthy traders and businessmen of New York, on notice that they were going to have to, and they did respond to some degree, make some reforms and some changes to keep these kind of things from happening again. The wealthy and powerful never like a rebellion, even if they're able to put it down, because they're fearful that the next one might be bigger, the next one might be successful. Also, another event that shows something about New York's character early on, which I think, again, has lasted into the modern world, is the foundation and formation of King's College, founded in 1754. And King's College won't sound familiar to you, but what will possibly is Columbia University. This is the origins of Columbia. It got a name change eventually. Columbia being one of our premier educational institutions of advanced education today, higher education today. As it says at the bottom of the screen, this is an example of spirited debate in early New York. So New York has always been a place where people can go and engage in not only practice their religion freely, but speak freely. So another example of what New York has always been about, and still is. What was the debate about here? Well, all colleges and universities up until this point, going all the way back to their formation in the Middle Ages in Europe, were religiously endowed universities. All of the first universities were Catholic because in the Middle Ages, Catholicism was really the only game in town. Once the Protestant Reformation happens in the 16th century, then you start to see some universities that are endowed by one or another Protestant denominations. And so you see the same on this side of the Atlantic. Harvard College, later university, as we should know already, was a Puritan or Calvinist university, so founded by Calvinists. To pick another one, Princeton University in New Jersey. Princeton was a Presbyterian college, and this one was originally slated to be an Anglican university. And the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, they mean the same thing, was actually the official Church of England, meaning it was the one that was preferred by the government. The government basically coerced people into going to and being members of that church. But the debate that broke out in New York was about whether King's College should be religiously endowed at all. Those that thought so believed that it should become an Anglican college, but those that did not said something quite novel and quite new, and that is, why do we need to have a university or college that has a religious foundation at all? Why can't we just have a secular college? Why does it have to have any ties or connection to any specific religion or religious denomination? Now, the debate was initially won by the religious side, and it did become an Anglican endowed, controlled college. But in a number of years, that actually changed, and it became a secularized institution. And so, over the long run, the other side in the debate basically prevailed. And this was something quite modern and shows, again, an open-mindedness amongst at least some New Yorkers of the time that I think we still see there today as well. So the early history of New York